Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to Art Week Tokyo online talk. Art Week Tokyo is an annual showcase of the creativity and diversity of contemporary art in Tokyo. It connects over 50 of the city's leading museums, galleries, and art spaces through 4 days of coordinated programming. The title for the talk is Where Are We Now? Revisiting Japan's Locality Art Phenomenon. The speaker for this talk is Andrew Markle and Roger MacDonald, and it is our pleasure to invite Andrew and Roger again. Andrew is a writer, editor, and translator based in Tokyo. Roger is a curator and a program director for AIT, which is a not-for-profit art organization based in Tokyo. Okay, now I will hand over to Roger. Please enjoy the talk.
Thanks, Yuko, and welcome to Art Week Tokyo online talk. My name is Roger MacDonald. I'm a project director at AIT, and I'm joined for the second year by my good friend Andrew Merkle. Andrew, yoroshiku. Welcome. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Andrew Merkle. I'm a Tokyo-based art writer, editor, translator, and educator. And I've worked with AIT on seminars and educational projects in the past as well.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that we can do this for the second year. In fact, for the Art Week Tokyo online talk series, this is a sort of continuation from last year when we spoke about alternative art education in Japan and in Tokyo. Today, we're going to be focusing on what in English we are calling the locality art phenomena or art projects. Chiiki art in Japanese. And I think this is something which has really helped shape the Japanese ecosystem over the last 20 years or so. So we're going to be delving into its history, into some of its contexts, introduce some key exhibitions, and also introduce some of the critical texts and thinking around this phenomena, both in Japanese and in English. And hopefully we'll wrap up by addressing some more pertinent questions which relate to our current age and also broader international context. So, yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. Yeah, in that sense, maybe it would be good to start by defining or giving people a working definition of this term, chiiki ato. The term chiiki art was coined or at least popularized by a critic, Fujita Naoya, who was writing for the literary journal Subaru in 2014 on addressing his concerns about the issues with locally organized art events that were being produced for the sake of community revitalization, urban revitalization, regional revitalization. And so this term chiiki art that he introduces in his text is actually something of a loosely pejorative term. He's talking about how these events sort of are hooked into notions of community or locality and use that as a selling point to generate essentially tourism into their communities. And he raises questions about what that does to the critical impact of art. But the Japanese term chiiki is in fact very ambiguous. It can mean a community, as in a collective of individuals or a neighborhood. It can mean a local place, a locality. And it can also mean a region or broader territory. So we would also talk about the Asia-Pacific region in terms of chiiki as well. So it covers this a tremendous scope. And I think even when we speak in Japanese about chiiki art, there's a lot of confusion as to what it's actually referring to. There's a tendency to think of it as art projects that are basically produced in the hinterlands in opposition to the metropolis of Tokyo. And there is an aspect of that, but it's not necessarily a straightforward opposition. We can have cheeky art or locality art projects in Tokyo as well, and in urban centers as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot to tease out about how to process this term, but it has been, as you said, a really important term for discussing the art ecosystem of Japan over the past 2 decades. And I think Fujita in his article was responding in part to the Echigo Tsumari Art Triennial, which has sort of established the template of Chiiki art as we know it. And in that sense, it tends to refer to periodic festivals or large-scale exhibitions, but it can also refer to smaller one-off projects that are rooted in communities.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Andrew. A really good base to which to begin our discussion. And I thought perhaps I could begin by just offering a kind of very broad historical context for talking about locality art, Chiiki art. Particularly, I think you mentioned in your introduction, there tends to be a view of these projects happening in the rural, outside of the metropolises. And I think this is there's good reason for this in the fact that some of the largest, most well-known festivals do happen outside the metropolises. Also, I think there is a kind of interesting historical lineage in Japanese history post-war, particularly from the 1970s, the 80s, entering the bubble economic period, where there was this kind of village revitalization movement almost, in Japanese called Mura Okoshi, literally sort of, revitalizing small villages, basically to promote tourism, generate local income, to supplement basically what was a declining agricultural sector and forestry, which continues rampantly to this day. And these all feed into, I think, Chiiki art as we're going to discuss it today. But I think this kind of idea of village revitalization from the 70s through the 80s, it actually gives us an interesting kind of framework in which to rethink kind of locality art as well. They tended, I think these projects in the 70s, 80s tended to be begun by local authorities. Public money or indeed state money was often injected into local areas to perhaps create regional products, interesting foodstuffs, chiiki no seihin. Also historical or cultural items were often created, or certain places were sort of made into tourist sites, and also natural resources. This is a classic one: mountains, hiking areas, etc., etc. So this idea that certain aspects of nature can almost be sort of commercialized or made into zones of profit, to put it very crudely, I suppose. I think this kind of feeds into a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which essentially happens from the late 1990s through the 21st century. I think there are also interesting ideas about nature itself, which underlie a lot of this from these early village revitalization projects, particularly the idea that nature is something intrinsically and morally good. Basically, it's nature. As soon as we mention the word nature in Japan, it has this kind of moral authority. It's something which is positive. I think this something which perhaps continues as a deep assumption amongst a lot of locality art projects. Nature is something perhaps even sacred, we can say. The grace of nature. In Japan, we often say, shizen no onkei, literally sort of, what nature gives human beings or culture. And I think these kind of assumptions remain something deep-rooted in the background of particularly rural locality art projects. I'll be discussing in a minute Echigo Tsumari, which Andrew also already mentioned, but I think Echigo Tsumari definitely has these sort of deep-rooted assumptions about nature in its kind of deep DNA, in a sense. I'm reminded of, the Marxist scholar Raymond Williams. He talks about this term residual culture, which is something which is kind of archaic, or it's something from a very harks back to sort of a long historical lineage, but remains a very strong presence in the now. And I think in a way, nature, as understood by a lot of the curators, the artists that participate in locality art phenomena, they perhaps take on some of these assumptions about what nature itself is, or it can be projected as through these projects. So I think that's a kind of interesting historical background through which we can think about these. Taking the discussion perhaps a little more up to date, I think certainly there are precedents in Japan and internationally for these kinds of locality art phenomena that we're calling. Perhaps in Europe, the most famous and one that indeed has been cited as a direct influence for Echigo Tsumari Art Triennale is the Münster sculpture project, started in 1977. Caspar Koenig, the famous curator. I think this is one example, basically a very expanded idea of a sculpture park, I suppose, that takes over an entire town, entire sort of rural area. In Japan also, I think, there are really interesting examples if we look into the details. I mean, I came up with the idea of Buto dances, I think in the 70s and 80s. People like Tanaka Min, famous Buto dancers, who would set up effectively commune studios in the countryside, where young dancers would congregate and they would farm and they would dance and they would rehearse and kind of integrate into the local farming community in some way. And I think perhaps the most famous example of this would be Tanaka Min, the dancer's art camp Hakushune, which happened in Yamanashi Prefecture, quite a mountainous region about a couple of hours away from Tokyo. So, I think there are interesting precedents to what we're talking about, but certainly underlying the more recent phenomena, undoubtedly is a very important socio-economic and demographic kind of context.
Right. Well, just to jump in
Yeah.
on the 1970s context, the other interesting thing is that there were a lot of open air sculpture exhibitions
Good point.
happening at that time, and even the Monoha phenomenon sort of was christened at one of those open air exhibitions.
That's really true, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, like almost an extension of land art, or sort of a Japanese extension of that sort of movement, maybe in the 70s and 80s. That's really good. But I think certainly the unique sort of demographic and as economic social contexts in Japan from particularly the 90s onwards has really been, I think, the kind of key context for thinking about locality art in Japan, I think. And it's funny, I mean, I often think if you do a quick Google search, regional art, contemporary art festivals, or regional contemporary art regeneration, invariably the top 9 out of 10 results relate to Japan, Japanese projects. And there's very little about projects in Europe or in the States or South America, for instance. So it makes you wonder, what is it about Japan that has spurred this kind of quite unique mode of exhibition making? And I mean, certainly this is something which other writers, Adrian Favell, for instance, sociologist, others have obviously talked about, but it's this kind of idea of art in a so-called post-growth period, an era when the bubble economy is essentially burst. The average demographics of age of Japan is aging rapidly. So basically Japan, I think by 2030 will be an inverted pyramid. So, it'll be elderly population supporting a shrinking younger population. So there's this kind of great demographic shift happening in Japan. And Japan, in that sense, is a kind of a forebear of what's probably will happen in Europe and in the States within the next 30 to 50 years. So in many ways, it's a kind of test laboratory type of situation, maybe, and how art could turn out in other parts of the world when its sort of demographic and economic situation maybe becomes similar, So So basically this idea of, the rural depopulation, the rural economy is declining, forestry, agriculture, all these traditionally strong industries in Japan are in decline. How to, regenerate, generate income, jobs, attract people to live in these places. And from, the late 90s, the early 2000s, we see art being used as this primary sort of branding tool, I think we can say, an instrument, to basically rebrand a particular rural area. This is particularly so for rural areas, but I think a similar thing can be said for some metropolitan areas. Parts of Yokohama, the Koganecho area of Yokohama, for instance, is a good example of an urban area which has been sort of maybe run down for many years, and curators and artists are sort of injected with public money to somehow sort of
gentrify.
Gentrify, to put it simply, I suppose. At this time, I think concomitantly what's happening with the Japanese government is they're sort of coming out with this sort of great sort of mantra of cool Japan, which is kind of interesting, I think, because it does pose this very sort of diametrically opposed idea of branding Japan as a very cool, hip, urban destination for international travelers. Basically based around J-pop, animation, manga, video games, fashion.
Ramen,
consumer electronics. These kind of key words are subsumed under this rubric of cool Japan. And almost what we're talking about today, the locality art phenomena, is almost something kind of, in opposition to that branding of Japan. It's something which is maybe harking back to, as I said in the beginning, a kind of romanticized, maybe a pastoral vision of an earlier kind of Japan, pre-bubble era, maybe.
Well, I think cool Japan is maybe projected outwards, and cheeky art or locality art is really projected inwards.
Domestic,
even though it has an international framework.
No, that's really true. Yeah. And I mean, I think so. I mean, maybe I can at this point introduce the Echigo Tsumari Art Triennale, which really is one of the most famous, well, it is the most famous and pioneering locality art festival, I think, which is still ongoing. It's happening, I think, this year as we speak. It's called the Echigo Tsumari Triennale, Art Triennale, begun the first edition in 2000. Its artistic director and founder is a curator called Kitagawa Fram. And the edition in 2000, the very first edition, it covered a huge area. It's like roughly 750 square kilometers of geographical territory is covered within the orbit of the art exhibition. There's, I think the first edition, around 140 groups and individual artists are invited from over 30 countries. It attracted, edition one, around 160,000 visitors. So this is quite a large number for a contemporary art project in Japan. Interestingly, I think from the first edition, Kitagawa, the director, he structured the exhibition so that there was an art advisory committee. So, for instance, on the first edition, Okui Enwezo, the curator, is one of the art advisors. Nancy Spector is one of the art advisors. And every year that it's happened, there is this sort of international body of well-known curators who advise Kitagawa, presumably for the more famous, well-known international contingent of artists to take part in. They have a very interesting use of public money and public funding, I think. For instance, I remember Kitagawa-san saying from the first edition, they would allocate funds for public building projects, which would normally just go for road maintenance or for building little sort of parks in city centers. And he somehow managed to negotiate with the localities to use that budget and give it to artists and architects to somehow make parks as artworks, or, road dividers as artworks or sculptures. So it was a kind of a creative use of public taxpayers' money, I think, in many ways. And basically, Kitagawa, he has a lot in common with this idea of a kind of village regeneration. I mean, a lot of the language he uses, if you read his interviews, watch his videos, he often talks about chiki no shigen. Shigen is the capital, natural capital, or the resources of a particular area, which artists and architects help tease out and make more attractive. And hence, he often talks about turning negative assets, like dilapidated houses, into positive assets, which bring income into a local area. So these are the sort of language and that Kitagawa uses. Basically, Echigo Tsumari has been a success model, emulated amongst other festivals. One in particular would be, and this is Mr. Fram standing in front of a work by the Kabakovs. As you can see, it's kind of like a very wild, rural farmland region. And basically artists, this is a small park by the Finnish architect firm Casagrande and Rintala. Artists and architects would intervene into specifics of geographies, into specific local communities, work with local people, often spend a month or more living there and making works. And this has basically generated a very specific vocabulary or grammar for other art projects that happen in Japan, I think. And this has been really interesting. I mean, just to briefly say some of the characteristics of these projects as outlined by the critic Kumakura Sumiko-san. She talks about this kind of art as being very process-based. It's very site-specific. It's sustained or durational. It spans perhaps long periods of time. It's collaborative. It's use of volunteers and local people, and it engages fields beyond art. So this is Kumakura gives us some quite interesting definitions of what this kind of locality art can be. It's now a brand, as I say, and it's been expanding to other parts of Japan. It's now even used by the Prime Minister's office, by the government, to basically promote art and culture in Japan itself. If you type into YouTube search, contemporary art, regeneration, some of the top searches are basically videos, very slickly produced videos by the Prime Minister's Office of Japan. And Kitagawa-san is interviewed in these videos. So it's, after 20 years, it's become almost the grammar of the official Japanese government inbound tourist kind of promotion, which is kind of, I think, very telling in many ways. Certainly some individual artists have also initiated projects by themselves with public funding and private funding. One in particular is the artist Yukinori Yanagi, who has created a very kind of long durational project on this island called Inujima. This is a flyer for his project. He's basically using a lot of the same language and grammar that have been used in these projects, and basically envisioning a kind of post-industrial museum, an art park in post-industrial sites. And he's made a museum using solar and wind power, gift shops, cafes, etc., etc. So basically sort of art tourism on a grand scale, artist-led, but sometimes curatorially led. And I think these have kind of provided a very, very interesting parallel art world to the art world of museums and galleries in Japan, certainly over the last 20 years now.
Right, yeah. And the interesting thing about Fram Kitagawa is that he has his roots go back to the radical student movement in the 1960s when he was a student at Tokyo University of the Arts.
Yeah.
and that informs his thinking. But at the same time, he's become so successful with this Echigo model that he now has a portfolio of locality art projects. I don't even know how many he has in there, but some of the others include Setouchi Triennale. There's also the Japan Alps Art Festival, which is in Nagano, and then the Okunoto Triennale, which is on the west coast of Japan. And those are all ostensibly projects that he's supervising, probably with the help of a team of other curators as well. But
so, I mean, perhaps Andrew, you want to introduce some alternative kind of models for these kinds of art events which have happened. I mean, it's not all about these kind of mega public money funded projects. I think there are some other interesting initiatives made by curators and artists.
Right. And I think as I was listening to you, it was really striking how much the village revitalization, the tactics of the village revitalization program had actually carried over into the Chiiki art program with this idea of finding some kind of local specialty, local hook to get people to first come to the locality and then spend money and bring things back home with them from the locality. And so, over time, art has become this sort of medium through which to market all of the other apparatus of the village revitalization program. We've seen certainly Triennale and Biennale style events popping up all across the Japanese archipelago. There's a Sapporo International Art Festival. There's the Reborn Art Festival, which is in Ishinomaki and was established in the wake of the March 11th disasters of 2011. Kyoto tried doing their own festival called Parasophia, Kyoto International Festival of Contemporary Culture in 2015. It didn't catch on for whatever reason. But there are all these different events popping up. What I'd like to, and I guess, one through line is that you're operating in a locality, you invite a range of Japanese and international artists to come there, work with the locals on projects, use disused infrastructure such as schools, warehouses, gymnasiums, archives, factories, and then have them create site-specific works. What I'd like to introduce are some quite unique models within that framework. And I'll share my screen now to put up the slides. With Echigo Tsumari launching in 2000, the whole locality art phenomenon really gained speed over that decade. And then entering the 2010s, we saw a lot of new events cropping up. But within that momentum, there's a project called Don't Follow the Wind, which a bunch of curators and artists set up within the exclusion zone in Fukushima after the March 11th earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident. And this is really interesting to think about in the context of locality art as an anti-locality art event. It has a lot of overlaps with sort of other locality art projects in that they're working with a specific locality, they're working within the conditions of the locality, they're working with disused infrastructure because all the residents of the exclusion zone have been dispersed to other parts of Japan as essentially refugees, internal refugees, and so there are homes that have been are in a state of limbo. There are businesses that are in a state of limbo where the owners still have ownership rights to those properties, but they're not actually able to live in them or go to them regularly. And so what these artists did was to connect with some of the residents of the exclusion zone and obtain permission to set up projects in those disused homes and businesses. And they invited 12 Japanese and international artists to come and produce projects there that would respond to those site-specific conditions. And every time they go into the zone, they have to obtain permission, and they're allowed to enter as essentially guests of the residents. But the catch is that the artworks are not going to be publicly displayed until the exclusion restriction opens. And so this sort of deferred exhibition becomes a form of protest, as it were, against the situation after the nuclear accident, the sort of lack of accountability and the lack of response toward the people who were most affected by the disaster or the nuclear accident, as well as the ongoing nature of the nuclear accident. So here we're looking at one of the tickets that was sold when the project launched in early 2015. And the project states that it starts from March 11, 2015, and it continues indefinitely until the access restrictions are lifted. In fact, Don't Follow the Wind also takes out a listing in sort of the Tokyo art listings map, and they've been taking it out for the past 7 or 8 years now. Where they just say it's ongoing project, but nobody can actually access it. This is a sense of what it looks like in the zone. These are the curatorial team who are visiting. And here's a project by the Japanese artist Meiro Koizumi. So some of these projects are really looking at the ambiguities or sort of contradictions of the post-Fukushima context. Meiro did some 20 hours of interviews with the owner of this particular house and used that to produce a sound work that is cited in that house. But the owner expresses his ambivalence to the notion of returning home and whether it would even be possible for him to return home. And this work was in fact, it's been installed since 2015. And then some years ago, the owner was given an ultimatum to choose whether to, destroy his home or to continue maintaining it by authorities. And so he chose to scrap his home, and the work was essentially destroyed with it, although it's going to be reconceived in a different format. But that shows you the time span of this project. And when the curatorial team, which is led by the artist group Chimpom, but also includes the international curator Jason Waite and the Japanese curator Kenji Kubota, as well as international artists Eva and Franco Mates. I think when they started this project, they weren't sure how it would evolve. They knew that they would put the works in the zone and sort of leave them indefinitely, but they didn't necessarily anticipate the level of contact that would be necessary with the local community, who themselves have been dispersed all across the country to sort of maintain the works and care for the works. And so the curatorial team has become caretakers not only of the works, which they periodically check in on, but also caretakers for the homes of these other people, of the original residents who are no longer able to enter the zone as often as they would like. So, I think there's this fascinating aspect of a kind of anti-tourist project, and also, the funding has essentially come from self-funding. Chimpom raises funds by selling works. They've raised funds by selling those tickets I just showed you. They've received donations, but they're really not supported at all by municipal funding or grants or anything of that nature. And over time, the project and the works have evolved. We're looking at Taryn Simon's site in the exclusion zone. She's set up in a former artist studio, and she set up a website to kind of host some of the last images that residents of the exclusion zone posted online before the earthquake. But she's hosting the website on a server that has been placed inside this studio building. And over the years, wildlife has started to intervene. So apparently wild boars actually broke into the space and kind of trashed it a bit, and paintings that had been put away were then strewn over the floor and so on. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting example of an evolving project that touches upon some of the tensions in Chiki art or in locality art, and also shows new ways of approaching the problem.
I mean, it's interesting thinking about it in terms of this keyword of nature. If nature is seen as a kind of resource, like capital for things like the Echigo Tsumari Triennale, I think for Don't Follow the Wind, it's almost in a sort of post-nature kind of scenario in which this art project is taking place. I mean, nature, I guess, is still radioactive and it's still essentially kind of uninhabitable. So it's this kind of completely different notion of nature as an inviting, sacred place, which is good and positive,
Right.
It's something, it's a really kind of thought-provoking project, I think, ongoing. Yeah.
And then over time, they've started to think of the wildlife as their audience and as kind of peers in this project. Yeah. So they're actually doing research on the wild boars in Fukushima. And so it's gone from artistic research or social research into this sort of post-human condition research. So that's one important alternative to the Chiki Art Festival or the Locality Art Festival. I'd also like to share another quite complex example, which is the Aichi Triennale. So this is an event that was launched in Aichi Prefecture in 2010. The then governor of Aichi Prefecture, Masaaki Kanda, had kind of put it on his agenda to establish an international art festival in Aichi in the run-up to the actual launch of the Triennale. And I think it is a really interesting model of art festival in its own right, because while the first edition was essentially centered in the capital of Aichi Prefecture, Nagoya, over the years it's kind of branched out to include other municipalities in Aichi Prefecture. Yeah. So it's a prefecture-wide event.
Yeah. It's like a dispersed kind of urban model.
So you have the Aichi Arts Center, which is in Nagoya, is always one of the central venues. But one year they were in a town called Okazaki. They had site-specific projects there. Another year they were in Toyota, which has the Toyota Museum of Art is a quite substantial institution, but they were also working in sites outside of the museum.
And this year, it's like even more in many ways.
Yeah. So this year they have projects in Ichinomiya, which is a kind of industrial town outside of Nagoya, and then Tokoname, which has been a site for ceramics and porcelain industry for a long time. And so they're able to provide the urban experience of the sort of traditional Biennale or Triennale exhibition, as well as this sort of more dispersed local experience of the Chiki Art Festival. Of course, all of that, and another thing I should add is that in the first 3 editions, they had also established a reputation for bringing in interesting curators who are not necessarily art specialists to present their take on art from a unique angle. So the first, the curator of the inaugural edition was Akira Tatehata, who is a respected art curator. But the second edition, they brought in Taro Igarashi, who is an architecture critic.
Critic.
And that was also the edition that followed the March 11 disasters. The following edition in 2016, they brought in the photographer and photography critic Chihiro Minato. And so again, he had his own take on it that was sort of tangential to what a typical contemporary art curator might have chosen. And then in 2019, I think they were being true to form in choosing the political journalist and activist Daisuke Tsuda. But of course, everything went sideways when works in his exhibition that were dealing with issues of censorship in Japanese society then triggered a huge censorship controversy in their own right. We'll get to that momentarily, but I just wanted to show some images from other editions to show how, to give you a sense of how this event had been taking place, had been organized until then. So in 2013, for example, a lot of artists were responding to the post-disaster situation. Here we see a billboard by Yoko Ono, Joy of Life, that was installed in public space in Okazaki. And then, for example, Lee Koshiga, who's a photographer who is based, I think, in Sendai, or certainly within the disaster zone, installed works at a site in Okazaki as well. And these were photographs that she had been working on sort of in the years leading up to the disaster and then in the wake of the disaster. So I think, this exhibition was a really, important formulation of responses, artistic responses to the disaster. And it brought together really interesting selection of artists, both Japanese and international. So I think it has, been one of the better, locality art events that we've seen in Japan in recent years. And I think it had a lot of promise. But then with the controversy in 2019, I think that superseded everything. But again, with the 2019 event, there was this display called After Freedom of Expression in English, which had gathered works that had been censored by Japanese institutions or refused exhibition at Japanese institutions, preemptively censored as it were. And these works were dealing with sensitive topics such as the comfort woman issue. There was a statue of peace by the Korean artists Kim Seo-kyung and Kim Yoon-sung. Was one of the flashpoints in this controversy. There were works dealing with the image of the wartime head of state, Emperor Hirohito, such as Nobuyuki Oura's video Holding Perspective 2, and works dealing with the Fukushima disaster, such as Chimpom's Kiai Hyaku Renpatsu video. So there was a big response from members of the public who objected to the works and called into the Triennale with harassing and threatening or even terroristic messages. And the result was that within 3 days of the opening, the director of the Triennale, Daisuke Tsuda, and the governor of Aichi Prefecture, Hideaki Omura, decided to shut down that particular display for the safety of the Triennale staff and visitors. Of course, that move in itself became a sort of form of censorship. And we're looking at the blocked off gallery the day after, or the day that the display was sort of shut down, with these two guardsmen standing in the hallway outside of that sort of, you see the wall in the background. And then in response to that sort of perceived act of censorship, there was a huge outcry from the other side of the populace who felt it was an infringement on free speech. Civic groups were making statements. It was front page news pretty much for the entire duration of the Triennale.
Unusual in Japan for a contemporary art event to become top news, also on television.
And artists also in protest then withdrew their works from exhibition. Here we're looking at Cuban artist Rainier Leiva Nuovo's installation at the Toyota Museum of Art. He covered his works with newspapers covering the controversy. And so you can get a sense for the media frenzy that had built up around the controversy just by seeing the number of works, each covered up with a newspaper from a different day. There were also other artistic responses. A group of participants established a group called Refreedom Aichi, which was sort of petitioning the organizers to reinstate the After Freedom of Expression display, and they established their own para-institutional sites for exhibition and gathering. So a group of artists established their own event space and hosted talks there and workshops there. And they also worked with the organizers to bring interventions into the exhibition space. So Refreedom Aichi set up a wall where people could write on Post-it notes about their experiences of unfreedom and then attach it to the wall for others to see. And so essentially, every time you went to visit the exhibition, something was changing. Somebody had removed their work, somebody had set up a new intervention. There were a lot of introduction of ad hoc talk events and performances, and it was an incredible discursive event in Japan at the time. There were also, eventually the display was reopened, and members of the public had to enter a drawing in order to access the show. So thousands of people would enter the drawing each day, and only 40 visitors were allowed per viewing, with 6 viewings held each day, for the last week of the exhibition.
Did you get to see it?
I was able to go in there as a press person.
Okay, right.
Yeah. I went on the last day of the Triennale to observe the drawing process, and it was really an event in its own right, just seeing how all of these people were sort of directed through the space and processed. They received numbers that were then drawn by lot. So, I think one of the touch points, of the Aichi 2019 controversy was how far is freedom of expression protected within public institutions and within publicly funded events. For a lot of people who work in contemporary art, we like to think that it doesn't matter whether the money is coming from the public or private sources. Art spaces are spaces that are meant for protected speech, or where speech is protected. But a lot of people who were opposed to the After Freedom of Expression display argued that if it's public funding, it should conform to certain values that are shared by the broader public.
Yeah. I mean, this raises an interesting question, just to sort of bring it back to the locality art phenomena, whether sort of these kinds of festivals, art festivals, necessarily have to be allied to certain quite neutral political stances, and they can't really make so many waves. And the fact that 2019, I think, happened, I mean, it was quite shocking that, you know, wow, it's something like this is happening. Whereas, you know, I think for the previous 15 or so years, most of these art festivals tended to just sort of happen fairly without incident. You know, there obviously are interesting works, radical works among any exhibition, but nothing that scandalized the country to this degree. Or brought up these issues of expression. So I think that was a kind of really interesting takeaway for me, was how, you know, locality art exhibitions perhaps have been kind of instruments, you know, to use sort of Claire Bishop's kind of framing. They're kind of easily instrumentalized maybe into a kind of broader agenda, which is acceptable to the powers that be. However the curators and artists want to sort of play it, but they end up being sort of held to certain kind of very basic subconscious kind of agendas maybe. And, you know, that's a kind of ongoing question, isn't it? Like in Japan, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that these events are on some level being judged in terms of their economic impact. So, you know, Echigo Tsumari has been so successful because it had the requisite economic impact. Aichi Triennale puts up numbers or kind of closing reports for public access after every edition. I don't have the figures for 2019, but in 2016, according to this closing report, the event brought in 6.3 billion yen, which is essentially 60 million US dollars of economic impact against 1.2 billion yen or 11.5 million US dollars worth of expenses. So, you know, I think you have to take those figures with a grain of salt, you know, but you know, certainly it is big business.
Sure.
And I wouldn't be surprised if the 2019 edition actually brought in more money.
Yeah.
I think it did, in fact, bring in more visitors than any
the publicity
edition so far.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, perhaps, I mean, I'm aware of the time too, Andrew, but perhaps you could introduce a few critical texts and writings about this sort of general phenomena in Japan. I mean, there has been quite a rich kind of bibliography, I think. I mean, mainly in Japanese, but I think recently a lot of it's starting to be translated there. So, I mean, perhaps there's a few that interested listeners, viewers can access that you can briefly introduce.
Yeah. And I've chosen, for the most part, sources that are available in both Japanese and English, with the exception of this first book. Fram Kitagawa put out a book of interviews in 2013, アートの地殻変動、大転換期、日本の美術、文化、社会, which translates loosely to Art's Tectonic Shift, Art, Culture and Society at Japan's Big Turning Point. These interviews, these collected interviews are a great way to kind of get into his ideas about Chiiki art and sort of the rationale for Chiiki art, how he approaches it, how he sees it as indeed emerging out of the legacy of radical politics in the 1960s. There is not any one source for interviews with Kitagawa in English, but if you Google Fram Kitagawa, you can find a lot of interviews online, both in text, and if you go to YouTube or other video channels, you can find videos as well. Another book that I think is important for understanding the context or the groundwork of the critique of Chiiki art is by the artist Tadashi Kawamata, whose practice involves site-specific interventions into the built environment. Sometimes it's in urban space, sometimes it's in rural space. But his book, Artless, Minority Toshite no Gendai Bitsu, or Artless, Contemporary Art as Minority, was published in 2001. So really very early on in the Chiiki art phenomenon. And he, in introducing his practice, he also includes several critiques of the conditions around this kind of urban revitalization or community revitalization projects and the instrumentalization of art. And that was already, in 2001, before we had really seen the phenomenon build up to the level that it has now. One of the chapters from that book is available in English on the Bunkacho's Art Platform Japan website, which features translations of critical texts of Japanese art writing. So this chapter, Contemporary Art as Minority, a New Catalyst for the Community, goes into how museums at that point had been basically turned into amusement parks, and they were being judged by the standards of amusement parks, which is to say by how much foot traffic they're bringing in, how much revenue they're generating. And he argues that that's an impossible comparison for art to begin with. And so essentially he understands that art is being not only instrumentalized, but also kind of alienated from itself in the name of art. So that's a really interesting text to look at. The text that I mentioned at the start of this talk by Fujita Naoya is included in his book, Chiiki Ato, Bijutsu Seido Nihon, which was published, I think, in 2016. The article was published in 2014.
14, yeah.
Yeah, and it's called, in Japanese, Zen no Zombi Tachi Chiiki Ato no Shomondai. And the translation is available on the Art Platform Japan website as Zombies of the Avant-Garde, The Problems with Locality Art. So again, as I mentioned in the introduction, Fujita outlines sort of these issues with instrumentalization, and for him, the zombies of the avant-garde is this sort of undead status of the ideals of the 1960s radical politics have been then recuperated into.
Right. So it's clearly a critique of Kitagawa, you could say.
Yeah.
And I think he say in the essay quite clearly that it's almost like a failed rebellion. Kitagawa's entire enterprise should be seen as a sort of failed rebellion of his 60s kind of communistic roots, basically.
Yeah. So he does, to his credit, he takes aim at Kitagawa openly. And it's an interesting read. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he raises, but I think it's worth, again, it sort of triggered a lot of the broader debates about Chiiki art projects that we have now today. And in the book, he also includes an essay by the Japanese art researcher and academic Kajiya Kenji, who in one of the chapters of the book outlines the historic context for these art projects. And this is available online on an American academic journal called Field Journal. You can see the URL at the top. But yeah, if you were to read this article in combination with Fujita's article, you would already have a pretty strong sense of sort of the critical stakes of Chiiki art. Don't Follow the Wind, in September 2015, organized an exhibition at the Watari Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, and they produced a catalog to accompany that exhibition. which is only in Japanese. It includes a lot of text sort of outlining the principles behind Don't Follow the Wind as a project and situating it within an art historical discourse. In 2020, 2021, a sort of English version of that book was published. It's titled Don't Follow the Wind, edited by Nicholas Hirsch and Jason Waite. And so if you're reading in English, you can get your hands on that book and get a pretty strong sense of the project. But of course, there's been a gap of 5 or 6 years between books. So I think the arguments have been updated since then. Regarding the Aichi Triennale 2019, I was surprised that there isn't so much academic writing about the incident yet. And I think maybe that also has to do with the pandemic. We were still processing the Aichi incident in early 2020 when the pandemic hit, and I think people just got sidetracked. But if you want to have a sense for sort of all the different artist statements that were going back and forth at the time, you can go to ArtIt, the bilingual Japanese website, where there's a sort of database of artist statements that were generated by during the controversy. And that's available in Japanese and English. There's a bit more content on the Japanese side, but the English, for example, we see in this image at the top of the list, the Artists and Cultural Workers Statement on Gender Equality and After Freedom of Expression. So there's some really profound statements that are included there as well. Yeah.
Great, that's a really useful list, Andrew. Thanks for that. So I think maybe we should sort of, it's such a big topic, we could go on for hours, but I'm aware of the time. And so, I mean, we're 22 years on from the first Echigo Tsumari, which happened in 2000. So, I mean, maybe just to wrap it up, we can each share our thoughts about, I mean, the usefulness or not, where these locality art phenomena perhaps are headed. If, as I mentioned in the beginning, Japan is a kind of case study of how developed societies are rapidly aging, and maybe it is a kind of interesting model of contemporary art projects for other countries. I think it remains a fairly Japan-centric kind of phenomena at the moment. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, there are similar things happening in different countries, but I mean, to this sort of degree and this degree of sort of sponsorship by local governments and the state, I think Japan remains quite unique in many ways. But I mean, for me, I mean, just to chip in with a final thought, I think it's interesting that Echigo Tsumari in 2000 begins under the rubric of Kitagawa's sort of 1960s kind of post-growth framework, and it's trying to re-energize. There's this idea of going back to a kind of steady state of economic, sort of at least well-being, or if not growth, at least some kind of status quo that can be restored to rural areas which are in decline. 22 years on, with various crises, the climate, population, food, war, are we coming into an era of not only post-growth, but degrowth? This is my big question that I would pose for the future of these locality art festivals. Japan perhaps has to actively entertain this idea of degrowing. And I think some of the projects like Don't Follow the Wind are kind of interesting examples of a kind of art exhibition in a sort of framework of degrowth in many ways. So that for me would spur other kind of interesting questions about autonomy, about self-organization, about the idea of a commons, about community building, about bioregionalism, all these sort of interesting issues which are now, I think, very pertinent more than ever. and how sort of art festivals can relate or not to those sort of issues. How about for you, Andrew?
For me, I'd like to take it back to the kind of institutional context in Japan of the museum as a contested space.
Right.
So the institution of art was introduced into Japan during the Meiji era reform period in a very top-down way, and I think that continues to inform how people see the museum as an institution. There's a lot of mistrust toward the museum. It's a heavily didactic space, and it's a space of valorization rather than discourse. And so you have an avant-garde reaction to the museum, which is pushing out of the museum, and then you have a populist reaction to the museum, which is also pushing out away from the museum. And so those two trajectories then kind of converge in the locality art events. And I think that's why we see the tensions that informed the Aichi Triennale controversy. I don't want to say that locality art events are all bad. I think they've been a really important sort of mechanism for supporting art production in Japan, and especially young artists. They give a platform to young artists who are not necessarily getting opportunities to show in museums or galleries. They're encouraging alternative artist practices. They also bring international artists into the country. The one who I always kind of associate with Echigo Tsumari, although there are so many, is Christian Boltanski, or Tsai Guoqiang. Marina Abramovich has a site-specific installation there.
James Turrell.
Yeah. And in this year's Aichi Triennale 2022, the American artist Theaster Gates has set up a space in Tokoname where he studied ceramics for several years. And that's kind of an archive of the intersection between Japanese Minge and Black culture in the US, which is really powerful. So I think there's a lot of good that comes out of these local art festivals, and they kind of support an archipelagic art scene of roving artists.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think we also have to be conscious of the ramifications of a kind of instrumentalization of art and how that would affect possibilities for freedom of expression. So the question is, I think within contemporary art, anywhere in the world, the question is, if something is being funded by the state, does that necessarily make it official art? Does that make it state-sponsored art? And I don't think we've necessarily resolved that so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the 2022 Aichi Triennale, which is ongoing now, we both went to see. Contrary to its previous editions, I think probably I feel that the majority of its funding this year from the private sector. And I think this is kind of telling in many ways, avoiding many of the pitfalls of taxpayers' money being injected into possibly controversial artworks, bypassing that and just going straight to big corporations and banks. Maybe it's a documenta model. Maybe we can say, it's something quite common in Europe and the States. But perhaps as funding generally and art patronage generally across the board decreases, I think, from now on. I mean, this is going to be also a kind of key question for how these kind of projects can continue, how artists can survive in this situation.
Yeah. And you mentioned Documenta with the controversy over anti-Semitic expression at the current Documenta exhibition. I think there have been calls from within German government to have more oversight over the exhibition as long as it's receiving government funding. And so that's a very slippery slope. And I think, that's sort of mirroring a bit what we're dealing with in Japan too.
Yeah. Well, I think time is up. So I'd like to sort of maybe wrap it up there. And thanks to Andrew again for a really wonderful presentation and sharing your thoughts on this. It's a complicated history. It's a complicated theme, but I think hopefully we've managed to touch a few of the key bases. And for those who are interested, please do access some of the texts that Andrew introduced, which I think are really important to better understand this sort of history within the Japanese context. So thanks again for joining us, and see you again. Bye.
Thank you very much, Roger and Andrew. It was an informative talk to overview the landscape of Chiki art in Japan. Please come back here to watch again to deepen your knowledge and interest, and have a wonderful time at Art Week Tokyo. Thank you.